and welcome to tonight's HRI Talk. My name is Hillary Dort, and I am the Manager of Communications at HRI. Thank you so much for being with us here this evening. And for those of you joining us for the first time, HRI Talks present new ideas, discoveries, and studies that are helping to transform the mental health and substance use health landscape in Canada and beyond. This evening, we have a special presentation for you. Today is Giving Tuesday, a global movement that encourages people to give back and to do good in their communities. Maybe you help make someone smile, help a neighbor, or donate to a cause you support. Everyone has something to give, and every act of generosity counts. It is in this spirit and in collaboration with our panelists this evening that we center this HRI talk on the importance of finding self-compassion in the healing journey and being your own ally. Many of us give so much of ourselves already, so we hope this talk will help light a path toward giving back to yourself. We are pleased to have over 245 registrants with us this evening, so welcome everyone. Please note that closed captioning and live transcription are enabled for this event. So if you would like to use these features, you can click the closed caption or CC button on your Zoom display. I'd like to begin this evening by sharing that the offices of HRI are located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Ottawandaran, Haudenosaunee, and Métis peoples, and the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We support the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action, and we are continually working to be more inclusive in our research and our everyday practices. We want to do our part to promote reconciliation and healing, and we invite any input you may have on how we can do better going forward. So for those of you who aren't familiar with HRI, we conduct applied research with a goal to improve mental health and substance use services in ways that can benefit more people sooner. We work with leading scientists, clinicians, and people with lived and living experience from across Canada and beyond. As a registered charity, donations do play a vital role in supporting our research and amplifying our impact. We ask that you consider making a donation today. You can go to our website and click the donate button. Thank you. So tonight we'll have a moderated conversation with our hosts and expert panelists. This will take approximately 20 minutes, and then after that, we'll shift to answering questions from you, our audience. We'd love to hear from you, so if you have questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many questions as possible before we wrap at 8 o'clock. And finally, before we begin, I'd like to extend our deepest gratitude to our corporate sponsor, CIBC, and our supporting sponsors, KPMG and the Otsuka-Lundbeck Alliance. HRI Talks would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. Our moderator this evening is Hannah Sung, journalist and co-founder of Media Girlfriends, an award-winning podcast and video production company in Toronto, Canada. Welcome, Hannah.
Thank you so much, Hillary, and welcome to everyone who is here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Tonight's HRI Talk is a conversation on the importance of finding self-compassion and its connection to the healing journey. Our panelists will share insights and real-world examples from their research and clinical practice. So tonight, joining us are Dr. Margaret McKinnon, Homewood Chair in Mental Health and Trauma, and Professor and Associate Chair of Research in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurosciences at McMaster University. Dr. McKinnon is the research lead for mental health and addictions at St. Joseph's Healthcare in Hamilton. Welcome, Margaret.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. And Dr. Hygge Schielke, who is the collaborating clinical scientist at HRI and the Trauma Services Development Lead at Homewood Health Center. Hello, Hygge.
Hello, thank you.
Yes, I'm so glad to see you both. And I think it's really great that everyone who is attending tonight has made their time to be here. It's something that you've done for yourself and for your learning. So I hope you can appreciate that we're all here sharing this space and wisdom for 1 hour. It's a busy life, but you made it here. Now, our goals are to understand the concept of self-compassion and its relevance to treatment, explore research that connects self-compassion to healing, mental health, and well-being, and to learn how to recognize self-judgment and cultivate self-fairness. So there's a lot of words in there that I really want to dig into with Margaret and Hygge. Why don't we just start with the title of this entire seminar, Be Your Own Ally. What does it mean for you to say to be your own ally? Let's start with you, Margaret.
Thanks so much, Hannah. And I think oftentimes we live in a world that's very busy, often very chaotic. We're faced with making really difficult decisions day to day. And often we're very critical of ourselves in these situations. So we all know, for example, we may have been rushing to get here tonight. I know myself, I spilled dinner all over a couch tonight. And I thought this is a really good opportunity to actually demonstrate self-compassion and to be my own ally, right? So I said to myself, everyone makes mistakes. I'm very busy. I didn't engage in negative self-talk by saying, oh, you're so stupid. Why weren't you looking? What I instead decided to do was to support myself in that moment and not engage in the kind of self-talk that we often get into with ourselves, right? If we think about these sort of situations.
Hygge, would you like to add anything to that as to what it means to be your own ally?
Well, I think Margaret gives such a beautiful example and tied it into that self-compassion piece, which is really about, in a way, really it's about being fair with yourself. So if you look at, self-compassion, there's lots of different ways of defining it, but the way that's probably best understood in the research is developed by Kristen Neff. And she talks about kind of 6 different elements that kind of go into 3 by like 2 side dimensions, right? So one is being kind with yourself instead of being harsh with yourself, right? And so Margaret just described that beautifully, right? So she had this accident where she was busy, and instead of being harsh with herself, which might have like come up as a thought, like, oh, part of me in the past might have been harsh with myself, but instead I'm going to be kind, because it's only fair that when you're having a hard time, you be kind to someone as opposed to harsh with them, right? Instead of seeing herself as uniquely failing, she said, I'm human. I make mistakes too, just like everybody else. Again, that's being fair with herself in that area. And instead of saying, I am all bad and all wrong and everything is bad and wrong, she looked at it in a balanced way of like, this is one event in the midst of the rest of everything I'm doing, right? And I'm having understandable feelings about it, but it's one thing, right? And so it's about being fair with yourself in the situation, really. And I think Margaret embodied that so beautifully in that example. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you, Hygge. And if I could just expand a little bit on that, we can imagine, for example, what would you say to your partner if that happened? What would you say to your child? You would probably say, it's okay, don't worry, we'll take care of this. How do we turn that same compassionate, non-judgmental lens onto ourselves?
Exactly.
I love your example, Margaret. I'm sorry about your sofa tonight, but I love the example because it's so relatable. And I think everybody knows what it feels like to very quickly go to that negative self-talk. Oh, how could I do that? That was so dumb. When in fact, you spent all day doing great things. You're going to an evening of doing great things, but just in that one moment. What does it take to practice self-compassion? I'll throw that out to either of you.
I think one big part of it is awareness of self. So oftentimes we go through our life, we're often very hurried and we're on the autopilot. We're doing things automatically, often without thinking. So a good example of that would be, you're driving home, you're thinking you want to stop to get something for dinner, but you forget to stop and you find yourself in your driveway, sort of on the autopilot. And we really encourage people to be aware of their own feelings and what's happening inside of them. So that may, for example, be a good opportunity to stop and think, what's happening right now? How am I feeling right now? Thinking about how to identify the emotion that you're experiencing. A good example of that is anger, where anger is often a secondary emotion. It comes from somewhere else. So that may be, for example, a sense of shame, a sense of betrayal. And we often encourage people to learn to recognize and be aware of their emotions. We can also be aware of a tendency to be harsh or judgmental with ourselves. So a good example would be, I was thinking in my own head tonight, I thought, oftentimes I would be harsh or judgmental with myself, but I tried to be very aware in the moment and sort of reframe the situation in a more positive light. And I think events like this tonight can really help us to gain that awareness. So to be aware of our emotions as they're happening, to stop and think about what's happening, and then try to adopt a less judgmental stance towards ourselves, or a more compassionate lens towards ourselves that we would so easily give to others. We know we are so generous with others. How can we then turn around and be generous to ourselves, which is often much more difficult?
Usually.
Well,
And
you know, I hear, sorry, Hygge, I don't want to
mhm,
cut you off, but I was wondering, I hear self-compassion and I hear the term self-fairness.
mhm.
Is there a difference?
Well, I guess as I was trying to connect before, that fairness is really, in some ways, a good way of summarizing the self-compassion component, right? So for many people, they hear self-compassion and that feels like like I don't deserve self-compassion is what comes up for a lot of people. And that in and of itself is already kind of a harsh stance, right? Um, if if you look at what actually tends to help in situations, so going back to something that Margaret pointed out so beautifully, that tends to go to harshness quickly, right? It's kind of embedded in our culture, this idea that for us to push ourselves to do well, we have to push ourselves to do well. We can't grow in a kind way. We can't grow in a supportive way. That if for someone to do better, they need to be pushed, right? It's because I'm going to push you because I care, right? As opposed to I'm going to support your growth because I care. And so the fairness really comes down to, like, you know, if someone's having a hard time, is it fair to kick someone when they're down, right? Or is it only fair to be kind to someone and to kind of be there with them? Is it fair to tell someone that they're uniquely failing, or is it more fair to say, like, you are human like everyone, and so am I. I'm going to make mistakes too, right? Is it fair to ignore how you feel, or only focus on what's not going well, either for yourself or around you? No, right? And each of those things really get in the way of really being present for yourself and others in a way that is really connected, right? Um, the other piece that comes into this is the shame piece, right? And so what happens really quickly is when we are harsh with ourselves, right? When we are seeing ourselves as I'm failing uniquely, or I'm bad because I did something I don't agree with, right? We then tend to go into a spiral of negative, not just in terms of how we think and feel about ourselves, but also how we treat ourselves. And that tends to become a cycle. And so one of the things, going back to your question, Hannah, before, which I thought was a really wise one, how do I help myself be more self-compassionate? Everything Margaret said is dead on. And the earliest thing might be just noticing when you're not being self-compassionate, right? Because we can so quickly just go to that negative, right? Especially if you grew up in an environment where either the people directly around you or the people around you more broadly tended to be more support through harshness, right? Like thought they were being helpful, but they supported through harshness. Then you're more likely to do the same thing to yourself, right? What's wrong with me? Why can't I? What, right? As opposed to like, oh, wow. So I'm having a bit of a harder time tonight. I might need to be a little gentler with myself as I go through this, right? What can I do to take care of myself? How do I give myself the care I need? What might be helpful to me in this moment, right? And maybe how can I learn from this to take it forward in the future? So this doesn't involve reductions in accountability. In fact, if you look at the research, people who are self-compassionate tend to be much more accountable, because what tends to happen with shame is shame leads you to avoid both what's happened and to often either attack yourself or attack others. All right, so you either avoid self, avoid others, attack self, attack others, whereas self-compassion makes space for you to stay connected and go, oh, okay, how did this happen? How do I do this differently? And how do I give myself the care I need in this moment to do those things differently, right? And it can be a real shift. One way to think about this too is self-compassion makes it easier to move to a place of like healthy guilt. Like if you did something that you don't feel good about, to say, I notice I don't feel good about this. How do I do this differently? As opposed to toxic shame, I am bad and wrong and don't deserve good things because I did something, right? And another quick trick that can be really helpful is if you find yourself really beating yourself up and saying, I'm bad and wrong and don't deserve good things, which can happen to lots of us, especially if you're someone who really cares about what you're doing and wants to make a meaningful difference, is to notice that people who are actually not good people don't feel bad about things.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're feeling bad about something, it's already proof that you're not a bad person. you're someone who cares deeply and made a mistake and then now trying to figure out how do I do it differently in the future.
Oh, I love everything you're saying. It's so true. It's so wise, and it strikes me as I'm listening to both of you speak that a lot of these topics are very heavy. And I think as people at home are listening, I hope that you can take a breath and pause if you need.
I mean, I would comment it's a pretty interesting distribution where the majority of people are falling within that sort of medium range, which really illustrates that we're not people necessarily who are very compassionate to each other. I think it's very much a part of the human, rather to ourselves. I think it's very much a part of the human condition to be somewhat harsh and somewhat judgmental with oneself. Very few people have achieved that very high range of self-compassion, and I'm not at all surprised by that. I think we also know from previous studies that, for example, women tend to be a bit harder on themselves than do men. And I expect that part of that is reflected in our poll results tonight. It'd be really interesting to see these responses split by men and by women. And women, for example, are taught by society to often be sacrificing themselves for others, to give up their own needs for others. And that can be reflected, we know from previous research, that can be reflected in being somewhat more critical towards oneself and somewhat less compassionate as a female as opposed to a man. And that's just a very interesting finding. So I'd be very curious to know in these data, how many individuals here were men and how many were women. Also recognizing that men can also experience that same sense of self-judgment, negativity, harshness, which society in some ways puts upon them with so many high expectations for them, which are often very difficult to live up to.
Margaret, the fact that you want to dig into this data is making me laugh a little bit. You are in the right field. Maybe we can move into having you tell us a little bit about your research. The idea of self-compassion, self-fairness, that makes sense, right? But, how does the research support that having self-compassion truly does help on the healing journey?
I will share an anecdote as well, Hannah. So many years ago, I was on board a plane that ran out of fuel midway over the Atlantic, and it made an emergency landing on an island, midway island on joint military civilian airstrip. And as I was standing, I'd run out of the plane because part of it was on fire. I was thinking we should do a study on the passengers. So I just want to share that. I think scientific curiosity is something that's really a big part of people who are engaged in research, and many other individuals as well, but really having that passion to learn and to study who we are as humans.
Is that a true story about the plane? It's terrifying.
No, but we'll come back to that for another event. But what I did want to say,
sure,
a lot of curiosity about trauma.
Yes.
So I'm really encouraging people to follow their passion, right? Follow your passion in everything that you do. Can you remind me of the question though? I'm sorry, I forgot the question.
Yeah, I was just wondering how we can bring some of your research knowledge in terms of understanding that self-compassion does really help with mental health and the healing journey.
Yeah, so I really appreciate the point that Hygge made earlier about how we often feel not deserving. So often, for example, among people who have experienced trauma, they often don't feel deserving of healthcare. And many will avoid going to a physician, avoid going to a mental health practitioner, because they have a sense that they don't deserve that care. And so I think in our own research, we certainly see that pattern. And I've also seen that in my own clinical practice, where oftentimes I really encourage people to think about, why is it that you haven't been to see your family doctor? Why is it that you didn't go to the emergency room when that happened? And often it stems from a sense of not feeling deserving. So it's really something, again, for us to reflect upon and to think about why am I not doing that? We did conduct interviews of over 150 healthcare workers and nearly 100 public safety personnel across the country during the COVID-19 pandemic. And while we didn't ask them directly about self-compassion, we did learn quite a bit from these interviews. And these were led by Dr. Kim Ritchie, who I see is in the audience tonight, along with our graduate students, Andrea Gialdandro, also Moda Kram, and others who really participated in this work. And what we found is that a couple of things. So first of all, just as Hygge said, individuals who have high levels of self-compassion are less likely to feel shame in difficult, ethically challenging situations. So we knew, for example, that during the pandemic, healthcare workers and public safety personnel were often asked to enforce rules that were really difficult. They were necessary for our safety, but were really difficult. For example, turning away visitors coming to a long-term care home because the rules didn't permit visitors to be there for the residents' safety. Individuals who had high levels of self-compassion tended to not take on as much self-blame for those situations or as much shame. Individuals who tend to see themselves as globally bad, individuals who, see themselves as someone who is deserving of bad circumstances, they did tend to take that onto themselves and blame themselves for those circumstances rather than the wider situation or the rules that needed to be followed at that time. And it goes back to Hygge's earlier point that the more we can be compassionate towards ourselves, the less we can experience shame and perhaps experience healthy guilt in situations where we have done something wrong, but healthy guilt that motivates us to change in the future rather than an overwhelming sense of being, I'm a bad person, everything about me is wrong. We also heard from healthcare workers and others that they often didn't feel deserving of compassion. So that they would say, for example, I'm really reluctant to take a break. I'm really reluctant to go on vacation because I'm letting my team down. I don't deserve this break. And I actually had the privilege of going on to COVID-19 units in the ICU units during the pandemic to provide mental health supports. And what I would often say is that, we sometimes need to put that oxygen mask on ourselves before we can help others. It sounds like a very trite thing to say, but it's actually a very helpful self-talk that we can engage in. So to say to ourselves, I'll be better able to help others when I've actually put that mask on myself to give myself what I need to be able to do this job, to be able to be present with my family. We also saw that people were really weighting their contributions. So people were saying, I had this role in the pandemic. I didn't make as many sacrifices as others who they perceived to be making more sacrifices or working harder. Therefore, I don't deserve a break. I don't deserve self-compassion. And that was a really interesting pattern that we saw in the responses of healthcare workers and public safety personnel. I'm really thinking about how we're all making sacrifices. Our families are making sacrifices. And it's important not to make comparisons, but rather to say, we're all in this together. We're public safety personnel, healthcare workers, people who provide support, leaders, because we want to help. And as Hygge said, people get into these professions because they want to help. And when something goes badly, they feel badly because they are such good people, right? We don't want to weed out people who don't feel shame or don't feel guilt. Those are exactly the people who we want because they have that strong ethical lens.
Mm-hmm. The oxygen mask analogy that you share is so powerful because it seems simple to say, but hard to do for so many of us. Hygge, I'm wondering, when we talk about self-compassion and self-fairness, and we've talked a little bit already about how we can bring it into our own lives, but how can we help others and the people around us? Or if we see someone struggling, how can we kind of cultivate self-compassion and self-fairness in others?
Mm-hmm. It's a really good question. I mean, I think one of the most important ways we can help others is by modeling, right? So usually the way we learn how to relate to ourselves is how others have related to us. And we then incorporate that in how we relate to ourselves, right? And so if we can see people around us relating to themselves, relating to us in ways that are compassionate, then we're more likely to be compassionate with ourselves. So that's one suggestion. Of course, that's easier said than done. And it means you have to know how to embody that stance too, right? Which requires a lot of work, which requires first noticing when you are being less than compassionate with yourself, not beating yourself up for that, right? So being self-compassionate about not being self-compassionate, as opposed to shaming yourself for shaming yourself, right? Which is so easy to do, right? Very easy to do. And notice that catching yourself is progress, not an example of another failure. Being able to catch yourself being harsh with yourself is a sense of progress that they're helping you change that, right? So having that sense of like, each time I'm able to notice I'm making progress, each time I'm able to be a little bit gentler with myself, I'm making progress. If I'm able to take a breath before I say something to myself or to someone else, that's also progress, right? one of the things in terms of like how I try to help people learn about how to be more compassionate with themselves is two kind of general ideas. One is one that Margaret brought in so beautifully at the beginning, which is, to think about what you would do for someone else in your exact same situation. What would you say to them? How would you relate to them? What tone of voice would you use? What kind of approach would you take if someone else were in exactly the same situation as you, right? Because then it's only fair that we do the same thing for ourselves. If we're saying in that exact same situation, that is what I would do, then it's only fair that you would do the same thing for yourself, right? So that's kind of like the quick, sometimes that's enough, right? That's the quick, like, the just do it approach, the Nike approach to self-compassion, right? But for many people, that's helpful, but not quite enough. And so what I ended up finding was that I'm not always a huge fan of acronyms, that there was something I could borrow from DBT and something I could add to that really seemed to help people have a better understanding of both how to relate to themselves with self-compassion and how to treat themselves with self-compassion, because they're actually two different things, right? And how we treat ourselves influences how we relate to ourselves. So the first part comes from dialectical behavioral therapy, and it's called the give skill. And there it's in DBT, it's typically about how you relate to other people, right? So if you want to have a good relationship with others, you want to be gentle, right, with people. You want to be interested in what's going on. You want to validate what's valid. You want to have an easy manner, right? Same thing is true for us. When going through a hard time, we all benefit from gentle care, right? We want to be interested. So this is the give skill: gentle, G, interested, I, in what's going on and why I might be feeling this particular way. Because sometimes we're really flustered, upset, we're not quite sure why. What's going on? Why am I feeling this way right now, right? Goes back to Margaret's beautiful point about being curious about why am I feeling, right? And why might I be feeling that way? And then V, validate what's valid about that. So, hey, it makes sense that in the midst of this stressful moment, so let's say in Margaret's example, I made a mistake, right? I'm rushing because I want to make sure I get there on time. I care about this. I want to do a beautiful job in this presentation, right? And so I'm going to validate that part of it, that it makes sense, as opposed to tell myself there's something wrong with me for that, right? I wouldn't want to, but you only validate what's valid, not what's not, right? So I wouldn't say like, it's so typical of me to blah, 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 right? Because it's actually probably not true. You can probably find some examples where you make a mistake and others where you don't, right? So gentle, interested, validating what's valid, and then easy manner with myself. Okay, I made a mistake in this time, but maybe I can also learn from it and do it differently. Maybe if I can't do it the way I'd like to yet, if I stick with it, I'll get there, right? So that's the give skill. That's like how to relate to yourself. And if we go back to Kristen Neff's definition of self-compassion, her stuff is really about how you relate to yourself, right? It's that first piece, that give piece. She more recently has also started talking about fierce self-compassion, like what you do, which is lovely to see, because she's the most well-known name in the field about compassion. So making it clear that compassion also involves action, I think, is a really important shift. And that's something I've also been working with people around too, because that action piece is, right, if you don't treat yourself compassionately, you're not going to relate to yourself compassionately over time, right? So it's not just, it's kind of like what we say with others, words are nice, but what are you doing, right? You say you're sorry, but you keep doing the same, right? That kind of thing. So you want to be, the give skill is be gentle, interested, validating, easy manner, but you want to give the care you need, right? The care someone else needs. So that care part is C, being curious, what can help? Of all the different things I know could be helpful in the situation, what seems most likely to be helpful? What are the different options that seem most likely? Then the A is acknowledging that it's hard to do things in a new way, right? That I might be trying to do this thing in a different way now, and habit is powerful. And so me trying to do something different is going to be a challenge, right? And acknowledging that there's probably lots of reasons why this situation is as hard as it is right now, right? Then the R is reflecting. So CAR from care. R is reflecting on, of the different things that seem helpful, what seems most helpful, and can I help myself do that? And that gets to the E part, which is of care, which is encouraging yourself to do that, even and especially. So I think it was the triple E. So encouraging yourself to do this new thing, even and especially when it's hard, because we really commonly can know what could be helpful for us and still have a really hard time doing it, right? And this gets back to that give skill, right? You're going to be gentle with yourself. You want to have an easy manner with yourself about that, and extra encouraging, right? And so sometimes we can't do exactly the perfect thing, right? And so an example of this, like say someone's trying to learn how to set healthy boundaries, right? And they go through the give care skill with themselves. They're trying to be gentle, interested, validating, easy manner, curious about what's going to help, acknowledging that change is hard, reflecting what's going to be helpful. And they go, you know what I need to do is just say no in this moment, right? But I just can't. So say they get an email requesting for involvement in something, right? I want to say no, but I just can't. So I could say something like, you know what, let me check my schedule and get back to you. And that way you've given yourself a buffer, right? So it's a way, like if I can't do all the way the thing that I want to do, what's the thing I can do that's closest? Because that's still progress, right? So in this case, it's a way of giving yourself time to figure out a way that you can feel good about saying that, setting that boundary, right? For example. So it's all about like progress, giving yourself credit for that, not shaming yourself for this being a hard process, right? Not shaming yourself if you catch yourself shaming yourself, but knowing, oh, look, there it is, right? It's a habit I keep doing. How do I change this, right? But being gentle and keep practicing. So that's the short version of how you help. I think so far that I've seen most helpful. Yeah.
So many amazing tips in there. And I love the point about practicing and acknowledging that you've made some progress. Practicing, I always say to my kids, right? Practice makes perfect. You got to keep practicing. I took notes on give care. I was literally writing it down. I was glad you went over them a few times. You know, truly useful tips. I'm going to keep this
I'm
right
so
here
glad.
on my desk.
I'm so glad.
Yes. Yeah. I hope people who are watching and listening are also getting some good tips. Let's go to the Q&A now, and let's open it up to some questions that have gathered. You can just click the Q&A button in Zoom to type in your own question. And I think Hillary has got one for us right now.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks everyone for submitting your questions. So the first one is, any comments on the connection between self-compassion and the prevention of compassion fatigue?
I actually don't know what compassion fatigue is, so maybe we can start there.
It's a fair question. Margaret, do you want to start? Because I was just talking, so I don't want to.
Whatever you prefer. So
Yeah.
compassion fatigue is something that often people who are in helping professions, for example, experience, where let's say that you work in an emergency room and you very often see accidents. You see people coming in who are harmed, often very seriously harmed. And over time, I think in a way of self-protection, you develop a thicker skin around that. I mean, there's more of a boundary between yourself and that other person, where to maintain your own mental health, you can't become, involved emotionally in everything that you see. But sometimes when, you see it over and over again, people have described not feeling a sense of empathy anymore. They describe how they feel they should be more affected by what they're seeing than they are. And many people, we find at least, become quite harshly critical of themselves around that. So they say, I should be more empathic. I should be affected by this. But often what we're seeing is the cumulative burden of continuously seeing those circumstances, and what someone is doing in some ways is having a healthy response to that by not continuously being emotionally overwhelmed by it. But it has been described in another way as compassion fatigue, where you've seen so much that you no longer have that response. But I think what's fair.
And so what would you say, about the connection?
What I would say is fair in those circumstances to ourselves is to say, I am somebody who I do have the right to be happy when I'm not at work. And we often hear this from people who work in trauma or in medicine or other helping professions, where they feel that when they walk away from work, they don't have the right to be happy because there's so much suffering in the world. And I think it's a really important lesson for us to think about having compassion for ourselves, to say, it's okay for me to be happy. Even though other people are suffering, I have the right in my own life to be happy. And that's one good example of self-compassion towards oneself. Also giving yourself permission to put that oxygen mask on, right? and to help yourself, because you'll be better able to help others when you do so, but also because you deserve that break. You deserve that opportunity to have a good life despite others suffering, which I think is that becomes a really entangled sort of emotional response to what's happening when you're constantly surrounded by difficult emotional circumstances that can be faced by civilians, by healthcare workers, public safety personnel, military members. We all face that at some level in our life, right?
Mhm.
It could be a teacher who's constantly seeing, really difficult circumstances in children's families, and you could say, why am I no longer reacting to this?
Mhm.
Well, in part, it's because you've seen so much, but you've also developed a bandage that's going to help you to survive those circumstances too.
Mhm. And yeah, really beautifully put. And one other thought that comes to mind in terms of the research, that the research actually is pretty encouraging in that the more we're able to be compassionately connected to ourselves, the more we're able to stay compassionately connected to others, right? So the metaphor that you brought in so beautifully, Margaret, of putting that, oxygen mask on yourself first, that's what allows you, as you put so beautifully, to keep doing that work, right? And so research shows links between self-compassion and resilience, between self-compassion and ability to not be as fatigued by doing this kind of work, right? Because you're having a fair relationship with yourself, exactly as you were describing so beautifully, Margaret. Like that when things are hard, of course it's hard, right? And we can connect around that as opposed to shame ourselves for it. And then we can get support for it as opposed to shame ourselves for it. So yeah, so it's one of those things where it's almost a little counterintuitive, but the more, because I think the culture can give you this idea that there's the conflation with like whining slash complaining as opposed to accurately just acknowledging, right? Because self-compassion is about acknowledging what is. Uh, and so the culture often can give up ideas around you have to be harsh with yourself to make progress. You're not allowed to complain, right? And each of those things get in the way of just having a fair relationship with yourself about what's going on. Because it's not necessarily whining nor being harsh to say, like, this is a hard moment right now, if that's the case, right? And then how do I give myself the care I need in this moment, given what's going on? How do I give those around me the care they need? And how do I do that in a way that is still fair with me if I'm thinking about to give care to others? How do that in a way that is also manageable for me to do?
Yeah, and certainly, you really highlight that research around, having a self-compassionate stance can often lead to experiencing less negative emotions, as
Hmm.
to be more accepting of your thoughts and the
Hmm.
circumstances around you, and being able to put your problems into perspective. So, for example, realizing that the world can be a harsh place, that circumstances can drive our responses, and that accepting that reality, and that often it's external factors that are driving our response. So, being rushed, being in a conflicted, war-torn world right now, this can really drive the responses that we're having. It doesn't mean that it's a all-encompassing, I'm bad, I'm wrong, but more, the world is a difficult place right now. It really is. And let's give ourselves permission to recognize that and say, this is really difficult. I'm going to give myself some extra grace, right?
Hmm.
Recognizing what's happening in the world, for example.
Thank you to the person who wrote in that question about self-compassion and compassion fatigue. That was a very rich answer. Hillary, I think you have more questions.
Absolutely, thank you. So our next question is, how do we encourage others or assist others whom we have close relationships with to consider self-compassion when little exists?
I can start if you'd like.
Please.
Something that Hygge's also talked about tonight, a really helpful exercise can be to say to someone when they're being really critical of themselves, to say, I want you to imagine that your daughter or your best friend or your parent is sitting across from you, and I want you to talk to them. What would you say to them? under these circumstances, and to have the person talk about that and then say, let's turn this back to you. And it can be very difficult to tolerate hearing that message to yourself, especially for people who've experienced trauma. You know, even hearing a compliment can be painful to someone who's experienced trauma, let alone self-talk that's very positive. But we can gradually build that muscle, right, to tolerate a positive message of self-compassion. When it's very difficult to hear these messages, we can also use skills like grounding to be present in the moment, right? So we often make a mistake, I think, in psychology and psychiatry, where we think everything is driven by thoughts, right? But in fact, a lot of our responses are also driven internally by what's happening in our body. So for example, we can all talk about, we remember something that we've done that we're ashamed of, and we feel like a punch in the gut. It's that sensation of being harsh on yourself, disgust. I'm really uncomfortable with what I did. Well, we can pay attention to that response, but we can also use our body to help calm and soothe us, much like your parent hopefully soothed you when you were a child, right? So let's put our feet on the floor. Let's experience the sensation of the feet on the floor. Pay attention to it. Imagine roots growing out from your feet into the ground and grounding you in place. You could use other sorts of senses as well. So tonight, I'm not feeling very well. I put on a candle that smells like a Christmas tree because that makes me happy, right? So I'm paying attention to that smell because it really helps me to be grounded in the moment and to be present for this event. So there's various different ways that we can engage in self-compassion, and it doesn't all have to be by changing our thoughts. It can also be by changing the way we respond within our bodies to what's happening around us, and using our bodies to ground us in the moment, to help us to be present, and to really tolerate not only our circumstances, but also for some people, even hearing positive words. Not only from others is painful, let alone hearing it from yourself. So we would really encourage people for whom that's very difficult to maybe try tolerating that for a couple of seconds and gradually building that muscle. So let's say someone says to you, you did a really good job, and that feels painful to you. Maybe just tolerate a little bit of pride, even for a couple of seconds, and gradually building up that muscle to tolerate positive talk from others, but also positive talk from ourselves, which we recognize can be really hard for people who've experienced trauma, abuse, or neglect. We really want to be compassionate to ourselves around that, and also compassionate to others, noticing that in others, and again, giving them the grace as well.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything specific that you think that you can add is very helpful for saying to people around us when we see that they are in a kind of practice of negative self-talk? And are there any other things that, like a stock phrase that can mostly do well and not harm inadvertently?
What would you say, who got to that?
Or is it even a way to listen instead rather than speaking?
Mm-hmm. I think it's both, really. So I was sitting with someone today who was just very, very, very harsh with himself. Mm-hmm. And you could see him causing himself pain with his harshness, right? And I think what I tried to do in those kinds of situations is to both reflect that I can see how painful he is feeling. In this case, he is feeling, and it makes so much sense to me that he would be in that pain given the way he's talking about himself, right? And I think one other piece that can really be helpful is, I guess, two sides. So one is, for some people, really the relationship matters, right? What you know about the person, what's going to resonate for them, all those things. Really commonly, again, we tend to relate to ourselves the way others have related to us. And so if I know from someone's description that unfortunately they haven't had a very kind, compassionate context growing up, right? I might say, unfortunately, it makes so much sense to me that this is how you talk about yourself and treat yourself, given what you've described, you experienced growing up. And at the same time, it probably isn't very fair. And is this the way you would want to talk to someone if they were going through a hard time, right? Like, how would you feel if you heard someone talking to a kid like this? What would you say about that person? Right? And often they will go to like harshly criticizing that person. It's like, okay, hold on. Instead of being harshly critical, can we just notice that underlying that is a sense that this kid doesn't deserve that? Right? This is a kid who's in distress right now. And how do we help that kid? We don't help that kid by being harsh with them. We help that kid by sitting with them, normalizing that emotions come up like this when you're going through a hard time. And right, how do we sit with that in a way that makes space for it and makes space for it to change, as opposed to piling on with more, right? And so, I mean, the exact phrase will always differ, but I think kind of it's really wise and astute thing about it's like how you sit with someone, because I think when someone can see that you're pained by seeing how they relate to themselves, because they don't feel that pain directly, they're too busy in the attack mode to feel their own pain directly. They know they're hurting, and they're attacking themselves because they're hurting because they're not supposed to hurt, right? So it becomes this cycle. So if instead you can interrupt that by getting them curious about why you look like you're, right? It's letting them see that it has an impact. Mm-hmm. And reflecting that back, I think, can make a really big difference.
Mm-hmm. I'm learning so much from you right now. Can we move on to our next question, Hillary?
Absolutely. So our next question comes from someone who describes themselves as a therapist. So this person is saying, I often focus on being empathetic, but recently got to know that empathy is connected with the part of the brain that triggers vicarious trauma, while compassion lies in the reward part of the brain. Could you please explain a little more on that and the research behind it?
I mean, I would say I'm not familiar with that particular piece of research, but I can certainly appreciate where that perspective is coming from. So, when we think about our ability to be compassionate, there is a reward of that for ourselves too, right? When we're compassionate towards one another, we feel good about ourselves. Often when people are engaging in bad behavior, they don't feel very good about themselves, right? And that's an important thing to remember. You can talk about people who experience abuse or neglect. We often know that the person doing the abuse isn't feeling very good about themselves in that moment, right? And that's a helpful way to think about how, for example, it's helpful to put up boundaries with people because you're actually helping them by helping them to feel better about themselves, which is kind of the reverse of what we're talking about. But we always want to look at both sides of the coin when we're talking from a research perspective. So I think being compassionate is rewarding towards others, but also rewarding towards ourselves, right? And I can see that relation with reward. Okay, what would you say?
Yeah, I might be thinking of a slightly different piece of research, or maybe we're using different words to talk about similar ideas. But I'm familiar with the distinction between sympathy and empathy, or sympathy and compassion, right? And so, like the sympathy is like the feeling with, right? Like, and the compassion and empathy is staying connected but feeling for, right? And so there's the difference. Like as a therapist, we want to stay, as people who want to provide care and support, actually, whether a therapist or as a partner or a friend, right, or a sibling, whatever, we want to be able to be present and connected without being overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Right. Because when we get overwhelmed, then suddenly the other might feel the need to help us. And certainly we're not in a position to help them when we're overwhelmed, because then our, right, to use this kind of term, like when we feel too much, our frontal lobes get overactivated and shut down, right? And we then can either disconnect and feel too little, or just be so overwhelmed that we can't think clearly, right? And so I think in terms of being able to be of meaningful help, it doesn't mean cutting yourself off and just staying in intellect. it means staying connected, but in a way that also, to use that term again, is fair, right? Like, how do I stay present and help someone see that what they're saying makes sense, that I can validate what's valid about that, or I can have compassion about what they're going through, without, if they're feeling hopeless or helpless, getting caught in the helpless or hopeless feeling, right? Or if they're feeling like there's no solution, going into that same kind of space, right? But instead to be present, connected, but still curious, right? Because I think that in those situations, it's our ongoing, both being present, connected, not minimizing anything, but also staying curious, right? It's like that secure attachment idea, right? So neither frightened nor frightening, right? When we're securely attached to ourselves, i.e. self-compassionate with ourselves, then we're able to be connected to others in a way that's also secure, as opposed to feeling like we have to solve everything in this moment for them, right? Or we have to escape from it because it's too much. It can be more like, all right, this is a big topic. Makes sense that we have these kinds of feelings about it. Let's stay curious about how we might address it, right? What are like the things we can do right now? What are the first meaningful steps we can make that can help make this a little bit better, as opposed to feeling like you have to solve it for the person, or you have to escape from it and shut down.
Yeah, it's so interesting. We did some research, I would say close to 10 years ago, with Anthony Nazarov, who's a former graduate student in the lab, who's now director of the Operational Stress Injury Research Center in London at Western. But what they found was that for individuals who had experienced trauma, they often had difficulty creating a boundary between themselves and others. So when they heard, for example, about someone else's pain, so I could say, for example, my close friend died last week. When they heard that information, they often took on the emotions of the other person, right? So they would take on the pain or the suffering of someone else. And what's, I think, really important from that research is to recognize, how do we establish boundaries between ourselves and others that are healthy, that again give ourselves permission not to take on always the pain of others. And part of that, the other work that Anthony did as part of his dissertation, was he found that for individuals who had had experiences of trauma in childhood, they often would say, I would sacrifice myself. I'm the one who deserves to suffer, not someone else, when they were engaging in reasoning about really complex moral situations. And so I think, there's a lot of how childhood continues to exert its influence into adulthood. And I think for the therapist who asks the question, there's a lot, we always talk about in therapy, peeling back the onion. How do we look at 10% of what we're experiencing right now is the present moment, and 90% is likely the past that's driving your response. So how do we peel apart that onion to really understand what's driving our responses right now? And part of that can be that distinction between compassion and empathy, but also understanding how, for some people, empathy can become overextended to the point that they're taking on others' suffering, in part because they believe they deserve to. And I think that really reflects self-compassion in a way, because self-compassion is so inextricably linked to empathy and sympathy, as you say, Hygge.
We have reached almost the end of our time for this evening's talk. I know I learned so much. Hygge, I was taking notes, you saw. I'm going to take everything I learned tonight and I'm going to apply it. I'm very inspired to apply it in my own life, for myself and for my relationships too. I want to thank both of you so much, Dr. Margaret McKinnon and Dr. Hygge Schielke, for taking the time to join us tonight and for offering your expertise.
Thank you to our
I also want to thank, yes, thank you so much. I also want to thank the HRI staff for their work behind the scenes to deliver this talk. And I'd like to thank the audience, that is you, for joining us and for your keen interest in this topic.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for moderating this evening's HRI talk. Once again, I'd like to thank our corporate sponsors, CIBC, and our supporting sponsors, KPMG and the Otsuka Lundbeck Alliance. We are so grateful to our sponsors and to all our supporters across Canada and beyond. Thank you again for being a part of tonight's event. We'll see you next time. Good night.